Good evening all, and welcome back to Paranoia Files. Tonight I return with 8 deeply disturbing accounts pulled from the darkest corners of forgotten American small towns. In this episode, we will venture beyond the safety of city lights and into communities where secrets fester, where disappearances go unexplained, and where the thin veil between the ordinary and the impossible tears wide open. These are not fabricated tales meant to entertain. Each narrative has been meticulously reconstructed from first-hand testimonies of ordinary people who experienced extraordinary terror in places most would never suspect. Drawing from police reports, personal interviews, and decades-old witness statements, these stories represent events that defied explanation and left scars on those who lived through them. To honor the privacy and protect the identities of those involved, certain names, locations, and identifying details have been altered, but the essence of each account remains disturbingly intact. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Paranoia Files for daily true horror content that will challenge everything you thought you knew about the places we call home. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when darkness calls from the most unexpected places. By 2016, I had been working as a deputy sheriff in Millbrook County for almost 7 years, and in that time I thought I had seen just about everything a small town could throw at me. Domestic disputes, drunk drivers, the occasional meth lab tucked away in a barn somewhere off Route 9. Nothing that ever kept me up at night. Millbrook was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the biggest news was usually who won the pie contest at the county fair or which high school kid got a scholarship to state college. The population hovered around 1,800 people, give or take, and most folks had lived there their entire lives. Their parents had lived there. Their grandparents too. It was the sort of town where you could leave your doors unlocked at night and never think twice about it. At least, that is what I used to believe before September of that year, before everything I thought I knew about my town got turned completely inside out. The call came in on a Tuesday morning, September 13th at approximately 8:45 in the morning. I was at the station finishing up some paperwork when Sheriff Davies walked over to my desk with that look on his face. The one that said something was not quite right, but he could not put his finger on what. He told me that Margaret Chen had not shown up for work at Millbrook Elementary School that morning, and the principal was concerned because Margaret never missed work. Not once in 12 years of teaching 3rd grade had she called in sick without notice or failed to appear. Her classroom full of 8-year-olds had been waiting for nearly an hour, and no one could reach her by phone. The principal had tried her cell, her landline, even knocked on her apartment door during her planning period the day before when Margaret had seemed perfectly fine. Now she was just gone. I drove over to Margaret's apartment on Sycamore Street, a tidy little 2-bedroom unit above the old hardware store that had been converted into residential space about a decade back. Her car was in the parking lot out back, a silver Honda Civic that she had driven for years, which immediately struck me as strange. If she had gone somewhere, she would have taken her car. The door to her apartment was locked, which was normal. But when the landlord let me in with his master key, everything inside looked completely undisturbed. The bed was made, dishes were washed and put away. Her purse was sitting on the kitchen counter with her wallet, ID, and credit card still inside. Her phone was plugged into the charger on her nightstand. The only thing that seemed even remotely out of place was that her work bag was missing, the canvas tote she always carried back and forth to school with lesson plans and student papers inside. I filed the missing persons report that afternoon and started the standard procedures. Called her family down in Georgia, who had not heard from her since Sunday evening when she had called her mother like she did every week. Talked to her co-workers at the school who all said the same thing. Margaret was reliable, kind, kept to herself mostly, but was well liked by students and staff alike. No boyfriend that anyone knew of, no enemies, no drama. She was just a 34-year-old woman who loved teaching and reading mystery novels and hiking on the weekends. The kind of person who should never just vanish without a trace. We organized a search party that first day, combing through the woods behind her apartment building and along the trails she was known to frequent. Volunteers from town showed up in droves, people who had known Margaret since she moved to Millbrook over a decade ago. We searched until dark and found nothing. Not a footprint, not a piece of torn clothing, nothing. Day 2 started early. I was back out at dawn with a smaller group, retracing the paths we had covered the day before, looking for anything we might have missed. And that is when we found the first item. It was David Kowalski, one of the volunteers, who spotted it hanging from a low branch about 30 feet off the main trail near Crescent Lake. It was Margaret's work bag, the canvas tote with her name stitched on the side. But here is the thing that made my skin crawl. The bag was spotless, not a speck of dirt, not a single tear. It looked like it had been freshly laundered and then carefully placed on that branch, hung at exactly eye level like someone wanted us to find it. Inside, all of her papers and lesson plans were still there, perfectly organized, not even wrinkled. No signs of a struggle, no indication of what had happened to her. I bagged it as evidence and radioed back to the station, and that is when Sheriff Davies told me something that made my blood run cold. Another item had been found on the opposite side of town, nearly 4 miles away from where we were standing. Margaret's reading glasses sitting on top of a mailbox outside the post office on Main Street. Again, perfectly clean, deliberately placed, like someone was leaving us a trail of breadcrumbs. Day 3 brought more of the same. A jogger found one of Margaret's sneakers in the parking lot of the Baptist church. Later that afternoon, a kid riding his bike found her watch on a bench in the town square. Each item was pristine, positioned in a way that felt intentional, theatrical even. And each location was miles apart, spread across different corners of Millbrook with no logical connection between them. Whoever was doing this was not just hiding Margaret. They were taunting us, playing some kind of sick game. By day 4, the town was in full panic mode. Parents were keeping their kids home from school. People were locking their doors for the first time in years. The state police had sent in a detective to assist, a guy named Bronson who had worked homicide cases in the city and treated us all like we were bumbling small-town idiots. He looked at the evidence and said what I had already been thinking but did not want to admit out loud. This was not a random disappearance. This was deliberate, calculated. Someone had taken Margaret and they were showing off. We started looking at anyone in town with a criminal record, which was a depressingly short list. Millbrook was not exactly a hotbed of criminal activity, but there was one name that kept coming up in conversations, mostly in whispers. Liam. Just Liam. He had moved to town about 3 years earlier, bought the old Murphy farm on the outskirts, kept to himself. People said he was odd, kept strange hours, had weird hobbies. Some folks claimed they had seen lights on in his barn at 2 in the morning. Others said he had cameras all over his property. Nothing illegal about any of it, but in a town like Millbrook, being different was enough to make you a suspect. I drove out to his property on day 5 with Detective Bronson and Sheriff Davies. The farm was about 6 miles outside of town proper, down a gravel road that wound through dense woods and past a few other scattered properties. The place looked run down, the kind of farm that had seen better days decades ago. The house was a 2-story colonial with peeling paint and sagging shutters. The barn was even worse, the roof half collapsed on one side. But the property was huge, easily 40 acres of land, most of it wooded and overgrown. Liam answered the door when we knocked, and I will never forget the way he looked at us. Not nervous, not defensive, just calm, eerily calm. He was probably in his early 40s, tall and thin, with dark hair going gray at the temples. He invited us in without hesitation, offered us coffee, acted like having the sheriff and a state detective show up at his door was the most normal thing in the world. We asked him about Margaret. He said he had seen the news, hoped she would be found safe, but did not know her personally, never talked to her. We asked if we could look around his property. He said sure, be his guest, he had nothing to hide. We searched for 3 hours. The house was cluttered but not suspicious. Old furniture, stacks of books, a computer in the spare bedroom. The barn was mostly empty except for some old farm equipment and tools. Bronson wanted to dig deeper, get a warrant, bring in cadaver dogs. But we had nothing concrete. No evidence linking Liam to Margaret, no probable cause. Day 6 brought the most disturbing discovery yet. Margaret's apartment keys were found inside the donation box at the public library, which had been emptied just 2 days earlier. That meant someone had placed them there within the last 48 hours, right under our noses while the entire town was on high alert. Whoever was doing this was not just confident. They were bold, reckless even. I could not stop thinking about Liam. Something about him felt wrong, but I could not articulate what it was. Maybe it was the way he had looked at me when we searched his property, like he was amused by the whole thing. Or maybe it was just my gut telling me that in a town this small with this few suspects, he was the only one who made sense. Day 7. I went back to his farm alone. I should not have. I knew it was a bad idea even as I was driving out there, but I could not help myself. Margaret had been missing for a week. Every day that passed meant her chances of being found alive dropped exponentially. I needed answers. I parked at the end of his driveway and walked up to the house. The lights were off. His truck was gone. I figured he must have gone into town for supplies or something. I do not know what possessed me to walk around back toward the barn. Curiosity maybe, desperation. But as I got closer, I noticed something I had not seen during our official search. There was a cellar door built into the ground near the back of the barn, the old-fashioned kind with wooden panels that you pull open to reveal stone steps leading down. It had been covered with a tarp during our search, and we had assumed it was just an old root cellar, the kind every farm property around here had. I pulled the tarp back and tried the door. It was locked with a heavy padlock. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I should have called for backup right then, should have walked away and come back with a warrant. But I did not. Instead, I went back to my patrol car, grabbed the bolt cutters from the trunk and cut that lock off. The cellar door swung open with a groan and I shone my flashlight down the stone steps. The smell hit me first. Damp earth and something else. Something chemical. Bleach, maybe. The steps led down about 10 feet to a small chamber carved out of the ground. And there in the corner I saw something that made my stomach drop. A sleeping bag, empty water bottles, food wrappers. Someone had been kept down there, recently, but Margaret was not there. The cellar was empty except for the evidence that someone had been held there. I radioed for backup, and within 20 minutes the place was swarming with police. We tore that property apart, brought in forensic teams, cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar. We found traces of blood in the cellar that matched Margaret's type. We found hair fibers. We found enough evidence to arrest Liam when he returned home that evening, but here is the thing that still haunts me. We never found Margaret. Not her body, not any indication of where she went after she was moved from that cellar. Liam lawyered up immediately, refused to talk. The evidence was circumstantial at best. The district attorney said it was not enough to guarantee a conviction for murder without a body. They charged him with kidnapping, but even that was hard to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The jury deliberated for 3 days. In the end, they found him not guilty on all counts. Insufficient evidence, they said. Too many gaps in the timeline. No definitive proof that Margaret had ever been in that cellar, despite what forensics suggested. Liam walked out of that courtroom a free man. He still lives on that farm to this day, still drives into town every few weeks for supplies. People avoid him, cross the street when they see him coming. But he is still there. And Margaret Chen is still missing. I left the sheriff's department 8 months after the trial ended, moved 2 states away, and took a job doing private security. I could not stay in Millbrook anymore, could not drive past that farm knowing he was still there, knowing what I believed he had done, knowing I had failed to prove it. Some nights I still wake up thinking about that cellar, about the sleeping bag and the water bottles, about the items placed around town like trophies, about Margaret's students who lost their favorite teacher and never got closure, about her mother who calls me once a year on the anniversary, asking if there have been any developments. There never are. And some nights when I am feeling particularly masochistic, I look up Liam's address online just to confirm he is still there. He always is. Still living on that farm, still free. Still, I believe, holding on to a secret that might go with him to his grave. That is the part that keeps me up at night, not knowing, never knowing for certain. Living with the possibility that I was wrong about him, but also the certainty in my gut that I was not. That somewhere on those 40 acres, Margaret Chen is still waiting to be found. And that the man who knows exactly where she is will never ever tell. At 2:47 a.m. on October 3rd, 2019, I woke up to the sound of my kitchen cabinet doors slamming shut downstairs, not creaking open slowly like they might if the house was settling or the wind had caught something. Slamming, hard, one after another in rapid succession like someone was searching through them in a fury. I sat up in bed and listened, my heart already racing before my brain had fully caught up to what was happening. Another slam, then another, then silence. I am Noah, and at the time I had been living in the small town of Ridgemont for about 15 years. I owned the hardware store on Main Street, the same one my father had owned before me and his father before him. The house I lived in was a 3-bedroom Victorian built in 1904, positioned at the end of Maple Avenue where the town proper gave way to farmland and forest. I had lived alone since my wife Rachel passed away from cancer 4 years earlier. The house felt too big for just me, but I could not bring myself to sell it. Too many memories, too much history. I reached over to the nightstand and grabbed my phone, thumbing it on to use as a flashlight. The clock read 2:47 a.m. I listened for another 30 seconds, straining to hear any other sounds from downstairs. Nothing. The house was silent again. My first thought was that an animal had somehow gotten inside. A raccoon, maybe. We had plenty of them in the area, and they were notorious for getting into places they should not be. I pulled on my robe and grabbed the baseball bat I kept leaning against the wall near my bedroom door, then made my way slowly down the hallway toward the stairs. The house was dark except for the glow of my phone. I descended the stairs carefully, keeping the bat raised and ready. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, impossibly loud in the silence. When I reached the bottom, I could see straight through the living room into the kitchen beyond. The kitchen light was off, just as I had left it before going to bed. Everything looked normal, undisturbed. I flipped the kitchen light on and immediately saw that every single cabinet door was standing wide open. All 12 of them. Upper cabinets, lower cabinets, even the narrow one above the refrigerator that I rarely ever opened because I could barely reach it. They were all just hanging open, their contents clearly visible but seemingly untouched. Nothing was on the floor, nothing was broken, they had just been opened. All of them. At once. My skin went cold. An animal would not do that. Could not do that. I walked slowly through the kitchen, checking behind the doors, looking for any sign of an intruder. The back door was locked from the inside. The windows were all latched. I checked the basement door. Locked. I went through the entire first floor room by room, turning on lights, looking in closets, checking behind furniture. Nothing. Nobody. I returned to the kitchen and stood there staring at those open cabinets. My hands were shaking. I closed them one by one, the latches clicking shut with finality. Then I checked the locks on every door and window in the house again, even though I had just confirmed they were all secure. I did not sleep the rest of that night. I sat in the living room with the bat across my lap and waited for sunrise. The next day, I convinced myself it had been some kind of earthquake tremor. We did not get earthquakes in our area, but maybe there had been a small one that I had not felt in my sleep. Something that had shaken the house just enough to pop all the cabinet latches at once. It was a stretch, but it was the only rational explanation I could come up with. I checked the news. No reports of seismic activity. I asked around at the hardware store. Nobody else in town had experienced anything unusual. Just me. That night I went to bed around 11, exhausted from lack of sleep the night before. I locked every door and window, checked them twice, and left a light on in the hallway just to make myself feel better. I fell asleep within minutes. At 2:47 a.m. exactly, I woke up to footsteps on my stairs, not the creaking of old wood settling. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, ascending the stairs one at a time. I could hear each individual step as weight was placed on it, the distinct sound of someone climbing. My entire body went rigid. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, aiming it at my bedroom door, which I had left halfway open. The footsteps continued. 12 steps leading up to the second floor landing. I counted each one. Then they stopped. I could not move, could not breathe. I stared at that doorway, waiting for someone to appear. 30 seconds passed, a minute, nothing. The house was silent again. Finally, I forced myself out of bed, grabbed the bat, and crept toward the door. I pushed it fully open and shone the light down the hallway. Empty. I checked every room upstairs. The bathroom, the guest bedrooms, the storage closet. Nothing. Nobody. I went downstairs, bat raised, checking every corner, every shadow. The house was exactly as I had left it. Doors locked, windows latched, no sign of entry. But I had heard those footsteps. I knew I had. They were real. They were unmistakable. Someone or something had walked up my stairs. I called the police. Deputy Matthews arrived within 20 minutes, a young guy I had known since he was in high school. He did a sweep of the house with me, checked the basement, the attic, every room. We found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no indication anyone had been inside except me. He asked me gently if I had been drinking. I had not. He suggested maybe I was still half asleep, that I had dreamed it. I knew I had not. After he left, I sat in my living room and waited for dawn again. I was not going back to sleep. Not after that. At some point around 4 in the morning, the temperature in the room dropped. Not gradually, suddenly. It went from comfortable to freezing in what felt like seconds. I could see my breath forming clouds in the air in front of me. I stood up and walked to the thermostat in the hallway. It read 72 degrees, but the air around me was so cold it hurt to breathe. Then I heard the voice. A whisper. Soft, unintelligible, coming from somewhere behind me. I spun around, raising the bat. Nobody there. The whisper came again, closer this time, right behind me. I swung wildly, hitting nothing but air. The cold intensified. My teeth were chattering. The whisper turned into multiple whispers, layered over each other, coming from every direction at once. I could not make out words, just the sound of urgent, hushed voices surrounding me. That is when the lights went out. Not just the lamp in the living room, every light in the house. My phone was in my hand, but when I tried to turn the flashlight back on, it would not work. The screen was black. Dead. I was standing in complete darkness with those whispers swirling around me, growing louder, more insistent. Then something touched my shoulder. Physical contact, firm pressure, fingers. I screamed and ran. I did not think, did not plan, just ran toward where I knew the front door was. I collided with furniture in the dark, knocked over a lamp, stumbled into the wall. My hands found the doorknob. I twisted it and pulled. The door would not open. It was locked. But I had not locked it after Deputy Matthews left. I fumbled with the deadbolt, finally got it turned and yanked the door open. I ran outside in my robe and bare feet into the freezing October air. I did not stop running until I reached my neighbor's house 3 doors down, the Hendersons, and pounded on their door until they woke up. Mr. Henderson answered in his pajamas, confused and alarmed. I must have looked insane. I was shaking violently, not entirely sure if it was from cold or terror. I told him something was in my house. He grabbed a flashlight and a hunting rifle, and we walked back together. The lights in my house were on, every single one of them. The living room, the kitchen, the upstairs hallway, even the basement light that I had not turned on in weeks. The house was blazing with light. We went inside together. Everything was normal, perfectly normal. The furniture I had knocked over in my panic was still on its side, confirming I had not imagined that part. But there was no sign of anything else. No cold air, no whispers, no presence. Mr. Henderson helped me right the furniture and checked the whole house with me. He did not say much, but I could tell he thought I was having some kind of breakdown. Grief does things to people, he said. Stress, lack of sleep. Maybe I should talk to someone. He offered to let me stay in his guest room for the night. I accepted. The next day, I called a locksmith and had every lock in my house changed. I called an electrician to check the wiring in case there was a short that was causing the lights to malfunction. He found nothing wrong. I called the gas company to check for carbon monoxide leaks that might be causing hallucinations. The levels were normal. I was running out of rational explanations. That night, I stayed at a motel on the highway outside of town. I did not care how it looked. I could not go back to that house, not yet. I slept through the night without incident, no sounds, no whispers, no cold, but I could not live in a motel forever. 2 days later, I went back during daylight hours to pack some clothes and essentials. I was planning to stay with my brother in the next county until I figured out what to do. As I was gathering my things, I noticed something on the wall in my bedroom that I had not seen before. Or maybe I had seen it but had never really registered it. There was a small door in the corner of the room, about 2 feet high, painted the same color as the walls. A crawl space access panel. I had assumed it had been sealed shut during a renovation years ago. I walked over and pulled on the small handle. The door swung open easily. Inside was a narrow crawl space that extended back into darkness. I shone my phone light inside and saw something that made my heart stop. Scratches. Deep scratches carved into the wooden beams, dozens of them, hundreds, covering every visible surface. And they were not random. They were words. The same phrase scratched over and over and over, "Get out, get out, get out, get out." I stumbled backward and slammed the little door shut. I left the house immediately with only the clothes on my back. I called a real estate agent that afternoon and told her to sell the property as soon as possible. I did not care about the price, I just wanted out. The agent asked if there was anything she should disclose to potential buyers. I told her no. I am not proud of that. But I could not bring myself to tell her what had happened. Who would believe me? And even if they did, it would make the house unsellable. The house sold within 3 weeks to a young couple from out of state. I signed the papers remotely and never went back. Not once. I have been living 2 towns over ever since, renting an apartment above a laundromat. I sold the hardware store to my assistant manager. I cut all ties to Ridgemont except for a handful of old friends I occasionally meet for coffee in neutral territory. Sometimes I look up the address online to see if the property has changed hands again. So far, it has not. The same couple still lives there according to public records. Maybe whatever was in that house only wanted me out. Maybe it had a problem specifically with me. Or maybe it is still there, waiting, building up energy, preparing to drive them out the same way it drove me out. I will never know because I will never go back. Not for anything. Some people say I abandoned my family home over nothing. That grief and isolation made me paranoid and I ran from shadows. Maybe they are right, but I know what I heard. I know what I felt. I know those scratches were real, and I know that at 2:47 a.m. on October 3rd, 2019, something came into my home uninvited. Something that made it very clear I was no longer welcome there. I drive past Ridgemont sometimes on my way to visit my brother. I take the highway that skirts the edge of town, and every single time, without fail, I make sure not to look toward Maple Avenue. I keep my eyes straight ahead and my foot on the gas pedal until Ridgemont is miles behind me in the rearview mirror. Because some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again, and some houses hold on to secrets that were never meant to be disturbed. When I was 12 years old in 1998, I discovered something in my town that no adult wanted to talk about, something that should not have existed but did. Something that has haunted me for over 2 decades and continues to defy every attempt at explanation I have ever made. I grew up in a town called Coopersville, population barely 900 people, tucked into the hills of western Pennsylvania. The kind of place where the mine had closed 20 years earlier and never reopened, where half the storefronts on Main Street were empty, where everyone knew everyone else and their business besides. It was suffocating in the way only small towns can be. But it was home. My name is Ethan, and that summer before 7th grade, I spent most of my time riding my bike around town with my friend Marcus, looking for anything to break up the monotony of those long, hot days. There was a street on the eastern edge of town called Fairview Lane that dead-ended into the woods. 8 houses lined the street, all of them occupied by families I knew. The Johnsons, the Petersons, the Woos, normal people with normal lives. But beyond the last house, where the pavement gave way to gravel and then to dirt, there was a 9th structure, a building that no one ever talked about. I had passed it countless times on my bike, barely registering its existence until that particular summer when curiosity got the better of me. It was a small brick building, maybe 20 feet by 30 feet, with no windows and a single metal door that looked like it belonged on a bank vault. The bricks were dark red, weathered by decades of exposure to the elements. There was no signage, no address number, no mailbox, just the building sitting there in a small clearing, surrounded by overgrown grass and trees that seemed to lean away from it rather than toward it. One afternoon in late July, Marcus and I decided to investigate. We left our bikes at the edge of the clearing and approached on foot. The building radiated a kind of wrongness that I could not articulate at 12 but can recognize now as an adult. It felt out of place, not just architecturally but fundamentally, like it existed in a space where it should not. We walked around the perimeter, no windows at all. Just solid brick on all 4 sides and that one metal door on the front. Marcus tried the handle. Locked. We pressed our ears against the door, listening for any sound from inside. Nothing. Not the hum of machinery or the whisper of ventilation. Just silence. Heavy silence. That is when old Mr. Peterson came walking up the street, moving faster than I had ever seen him move. He was probably 70 years old at the time. a retired postal worker who spent most of his days sitting on his porch. But he was practically running toward us, shouting for us to get away from there. "Get away right now." His face was pale, his eyes wide with something that looked like genuine fear. We scrambled back to our bikes and Mr. Peterson grabbed me by the shoulder before I could ride off. He looked me dead in the eyes and said 3 words I will never forget. "Do not ask questions." Then he released me and walked back toward his house without another word. Of course, we asked questions. First, we asked our parents. My mother went silent when I mentioned the building, then changed the subject to what I wanted for dinner. My father told me to stay away from that part of town. When I pressed him, asked him what the building was, he got angry in a way I had never seen before. He said some things were none of my business and that I needed to drop it. Marcus got similar responses from his parents. Complete shutdown, refusal to engage. We tried asking other adults, the librarian, the clerk at the grocery store, the mechanic at the auto shop. Every single one of them either claimed they did not know what we were talking about or found a reason to end the conversation immediately. It was like the entire town had collectively decided that the building did not exist, even though it clearly did. Marcus and I became obsessed. We started going to the library after school, digging through old newspapers and town records. We found property maps from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. The building was not on any of them. That section of land was listed as undeveloped forest. But we knew the building was older than the 1980s. The bricks were too weathered. The style was too outdated. It had been there for decades at minimum. We found something else too. A newspaper article from 1962 about a town meeting where residents had complained about unusual noises coming from the eastern edge of town at night. The complaint was dismissed by the mayor at the time, who stated that the noises were likely from wildlife or equipment from a nearby farm. But there were no farms on the eastern edge of town. There never had been, and Fairview Lane did not even exist in 1962 according to the maps. The houses were not built until 1973. That fall, I went back to the building alone. Marcus had lost interest after his father threatened to ground him if he heard him mention it again. I brought a camera, one of those disposable ones you could buy at the drugstore. I took pictures of the building from every angle. I photographed the door, the bricks, the clearing around it. I got the film developed at a 1-hour photo place 2 towns over so no one in Coopersville would see what I was photographing. Every single picture came out blank, not blurry or distorted, completely blank, pure white. Like I had never taken any pictures at all. But I knew I had. I had been standing right there. I had pressed the button and heard the shutter click 24 times. I went back to the library and found more articles, small mentions buried in police blotters and town council minutes, references to the eastern section of town being off limits during certain dates in the 1970s, mentions of state officials visiting Coopersville for undisclosed reasons. A 3-line obituary from 1981 for a man named Richard Brennan who died suddenly at age 42 with no cause of death listed. His address was listed as 847 Fairview Lane, but there were only 8 houses on Fairview Lane and none of them were numbered 847. I graduated high school in 2004 and left Coopersville for college in Pittsburgh. I thought distance and time would dull my obsession with the building, but it never did. It sat in the back of my mind for years, a nagging question that I could never answer. I moved to Philadelphia after college, got a job in IT, built a life, but I could never forget. In 2015, I decided to go back. I was 30 years old and had the resources and independence to investigate properly. I took a week off work and drove back to Coopersville for the first time in over a decade. The town had gotten smaller, if that was possible. More stores closed, more houses abandoned. But Fairview Lane was still there, and so was the building. It looked exactly the same, unchanged. untouched by time. The same dark red bricks, the same metal door, the same wrongness radiating from it like heat. I took pictures again, this time with a digital camera. Same result. Files corrupted, images unreadable. I knocked on doors on Fairview Lane trying to find someone willing to talk. The Johnsons had moved away. The Petersons were both dead. But the Woos were still there, older but recognizable. Mrs. Wu answered the door and I introduced myself, reminded her that I had grown up in town. I asked her about the building. She looked at me for a long moment, then invited me inside. She made tea. We sat at her kitchen table and she told me that she had been wondering when someone would come asking again. She said others had asked over the years. People who grew up in Coopersville and could not let it go. She said she did not know what the building was or why it was there, but she knew it had been there since before the houses were built. Her husband had asked about it when they purchased their property in 1974. The real estate agent had dodged the question. The previous owner had refused to discuss it. After they moved in, neighbors had quietly warned them to ignore it, to forget it existed, to never let their children near it. She said that once, in 1983, a man from the state came to town and spent 3 days taking measurements and photographs around the building. Then he left and never came back. She said that sometimes, maybe once every few years, she would see a car parked near the building late at night. Government plates, men in suits. They would stay for an hour or two, then leave. She said the last time she saw this was in 2009. I asked her if she had ever seen anyone go inside. She said no, never. Not in over 40 years of living across the street from it. I spent the rest of that week tracking down other former residents of Coopersville who had left town. I found 6 people willing to talk to me, all around my age or older. Every single one of them remembered the building. Every single one of them had been warned by adults not to ask about it, and every single one of them had spent years wondering what it was. We formed a group, started sharing information online. We discovered that there were mentions of similar buildings in other small towns across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. Always the same description. Small brick structures with no windows and metal doors. Always in towns with populations under 1,000. Always met with silence and evasion when questioned. We filed Freedom of Information requests with state and federal agencies. Every single one came back with no records found. We contacted journalists. None of them were interested in pursuing the story. We contacted paranormal investigators. They wanted to turn it into entertainment. We wanted answers. It is 2025 now. I am 40 years old. The building is still there. I drove past it last month, unchanged, eternal. Mocking everyone who has ever wondered about its purpose. We are no closer to understanding what it is or why an entire town conspired to pretend it did not exist. We have theories, government experiments, Cold War relics, containment facilities for something nobody wants to acknowledge. But theories are not answers. What keeps me awake at night is not just the mystery of the building itself. It is the coordination, the way an entire town, generation after generation, maintained absolute silence. The way records disappeared or never existed in the first place. The way photographs fail and inquiries are stonewalled. That level of secrecy requires resources, organization, and purpose. Someone knows what that building is. Someone has always known, and they have decided that the rest of us never will. I relocated to Harmony Falls in February of 2018, chasing what I thought was a fresh start and a decent paycheck. The town had a population of around 700 people, nestled in a valley in upstate New York where winters were brutal and summers were short. I had accepted a position as an accountant for a regional manufacturing company that had its main office there. and the salary was significantly better than what I had been making in Albany. My name is Mason, and at the time I was 29 years old, single, and looking for a quieter life away from the city. I got quiet, all right, but not in the way I expected. The first week was promising. My co-workers were friendly, showing me around the office and offering recommendations for where to eat and shop. The town itself was picturesque in that rural New England way, with a main street lined with old brick buildings, a white church with a tall steeple, and houses that looked like they had been standing since the 1800s. I rented a small 2-bedroom cottage on the outskirts of town, a place with good light and a view of the surrounding hills. It felt like I had made the right decision. The invitation started during my second week. My neighbor, a woman named Mrs. Callahan, who lived 3 houses down, knocked on my door one evening with a casserole and a warm smile. She welcomed me to the neighborhood and mentioned that there was a community meeting every Thursday evening at the church fellowship hall. Nothing formal, she said, just neighbors getting together to discuss town matters and socialize. She said it would be a great way for me to meet people. I thanked her for the casserole and told her I would think about it. The next day at work, 2 of my co-workers separately asked if I was planning to attend the Thursday meeting. When I said I had not decided yet, they both encouraged me enthusiastically, saying it was really the best way to feel connected to the community. One of them, a guy named Paul from accounting, said he had moved to Harmony Falls 5 years earlier, and that attending the meetings had made all the difference in feeling like he belonged. By Thursday, I had been asked about the meeting by 7 different people. My mailman, the woman who ran the coffee shop, the clerk at the grocery store, even my landlord called to mention it. The persistence was starting to feel less like friendliness and more like pressure, but I figured small towns were just like that. Close-knit, everyone involved in everyone else's business. So I decided to go, if only to be polite. The fellowship hall was packed when I arrived at 7 that evening. At least 100 people crammed into a space meant for maybe 60. Every seat was taken. People stood along the walls. The air was warm and close, heavy with the smell of bodies and coffee. A man in his 50s stood at the front of the room leading what appeared to be a normal town meeting. Discussion about road maintenance, updates on the school budget, a debate about whether to replace the playground equipment at the town park. But there was something off about the whole thing. The way people responded to the man at the front. Too eager, too uniform. When he spoke, everyone listened with an intensity that felt excessive for mundane town business. And when the meeting ended after 90 minutes, people did not just leave. They lingered. They clustered in small groups, speaking in low voices. And more than once, I caught people looking at me, not just glancing, staring, assessing. Mrs. Callahan found me near the door and asked what I thought. I said it seemed like a productive meeting. She smiled and said she hoped I would come back next week. I said maybe. Her smile faded slightly. She said the community really valued participation, that it meant a lot when newcomers showed commitment to being part of things. The way she said it made my skin prickle. It was not quite a threat, but it was not entirely friendly either. The next week, the invitations became more insistent. People stopped asking if I was coming to the meeting and started saying they would see me there. As if my attendance was assumed, expected. When I mentioned to Paul at work that I might skip the next one, he stopped what he was doing and looked at me with something like concern. He said that would probably not be a good idea. That people noticed when someone did not show up, that the community had certain expectations. I went to the second meeting, but this time I paid closer attention. The format was the same. Town business discussed, updates given. But toward the end, the man at the front, whose name I learned was Mr. Whitmore, began talking about unity. about the importance of the community staying strong and connected, about how outsiders did not understand the values that made Harmony Falls special. The room responded with nods and murmurs of agreement. It felt rehearsed, scripted, like a performance everyone had practiced. After the meeting, Mr. Whitmore approached me directly. He shook my hand firmly and said he was glad I had decided to be part of the community. He said newcomers who embraced the town's values always found Harmony Falls to be a wonderful place to live. He said those who resisted, who tried to stay separate, usually ended up leaving. Or worse, they stayed but found life very difficult. He said all of this with a pleasant smile, but his eyes were cold. By the end of my second month in Harmony Falls, I started noticing things that made me deeply uncomfortable. People seemed to know my schedule, where I went after work, what time I got home, what groceries I bought. The mailman mentioned that I had been driving to the next town over for groceries instead of shopping locally, and he said that was a shame. That the community appreciated when people supported local businesses, but I had not told anyone I was doing that. I had just started because the grocery store in Harmony Falls had started feeling oppressive, with everyone watching me shop, commenting on what I bought. I discovered that my landlord had entered my cottage while I was at work. I knew because I had left a piece of tape on the inside of the door frame, low down where nobody would notice. When I got home, the tape was broken. Nothing was missing, nothing was out of place, but someone had been inside. I confronted my landlord about it. He said he had been checking the furnace, but the furnace was in the basement and he would not have needed to go through my front door to access it. That is when I started finding the notes. The first one was slipped under my door. It said that the community had noticed I had missed the last Thursday meeting and hoped everything was all right. The second note, 3 days later, said that isolation was dangerous and that the community was concerned about me. The third note, a week after that, said that everyone had a choice to make about whether they wanted to belong or be cast out. I stopped going to work, called in sick for 3 days while I tried to figure out what to do. My phone rang constantly, co-workers checking on me, neighbors offering to bring food. Mrs. Callahan knocked on my door twice a day. When I did not answer, she would stand outside and talk through the door, saying she knew I was in there and that I should not shut people out. On the fourth day, I went into the office to resign. I told my boss I had a family emergency and needed to leave town immediately. He did not seem surprised. He said that sometimes people were not a good fit for Harmony Falls, that the town had a particular way of doing things and not everyone could adapt. He said he hoped I would reconsider, but if I was determined to leave, I should do it quickly. The way he said it sounded like a warning. That night I started packing. I planned to leave first thing in the morning, load my car, and drive straight to my parents' house in Connecticut. But at 2 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of footsteps on my porch, multiple sets of feet, voices murmuring. I got up and looked out the window. There were at least a dozen people standing in my front yard, just standing there, looking at the house. Some of them held flashlights. I recognized faces. Mrs. Callahan, Paul from work, Mr. Whitmore, others I had seen at the meetings. Nobody knocked. Nobody called out. They just stood there in the dark, watching. I grabbed my phone to call the police, then realized that the police were probably part of this too. The sheriff lived in Harmony Falls. His deputies lived in Harmony Falls. Everyone was part of this town, and this town operated by rules I did not understand. I waited until they left, which took nearly an hour. Then I finished packing in darkness, loaded my car as quietly as I could, and left at 4 in the morning. I did not take the main road out of town. I took back roads through the hills, roads that were barely maintained because I was terrified someone would be watching the main route. I drove for 3 hours straight before I stopped to breathe. I filed a report with the state police 2 days later. Told them everything. The surveillance, the notes, the people in my yard. They took my statement and said they would look into it. I never heard back. I called 3 times for updates. Each time I was told the investigation was ongoing. After the 3rd call, a detective told me off the record that Harmony Falls was a tight-knit community that did not appreciate outside interference. He suggested I move on with my life. I tried contacting a lawyer about breaking my lease. When I mentioned Harmony Falls, the lawyer said he could not help me. He did not explain why. Just said he could not take the case. I tried 2 other lawyers. Same response. Nobody wanted to touch anything involving that town. I never got my security deposit back. My landlord sent me a letter saying I had breached the lease by abandoning the property and that he was keeping the deposit to cover damages. There were no damages. I left the place spotless, but I did not fight it. I did not want any reason to have further contact with anyone from Harmony Falls. 5 years have passed. I live in Boston now. I have a different job, different friends, a different life. But I still get emails sometimes. Not often. Maybe once every 6 months. They come from addresses I do not recognize, but the messages are always similar. Asking if I have reconsidered, saying the community remembers me. Saying there is always a place for me if I choose to return. I delete them immediately, but they keep coming. And every time one arrives, I am reminded that I escaped something in Harmony Falls. Something organized. Something that has resources and reach and patience. Something that has not forgotten about me, even if I desperately want to forget about it. My name is Lucas, and for 17 years I worked as the librarian and unofficial town historian for a small community called Redstone in northern Vermont. Population 612 at last count, though that number has been slowly declining for decades. It is the kind of place where nothing exciting ever happens, where the most significant event of the year is the 4th of July parade and the Autumn Harvest Festival. But there is one thing about Redstone that sets it apart from every other dying rural town in New England. Every year on November 12th, something happens here. Something that has been happening for as long as anyone can remember. Something that the town has learned to accept, but never discuss with outsiders. I first learned about it during my 2nd week on the job in 2006. I was organizing the local history section in the basement archives when I came across a collection of journals dating back to 1887. They were handwritten ledgers kept by previous town clerks documenting births, deaths, property transfers, and other municipal matters. Most of it was dry administrative record keeping, but every single journal without exception had an entry for November 12th that simply read, "The occurrence," no details. No explanation. Just those 2 words year after year spanning more than a century. I asked the head librarian at the time, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, what the occurrence referred to. She looked at me for a long moment, then said I would find out soon enough. November was only 3 weeks away. She told me not to make plans to leave town that day. When I pressed her for more information, she simply said that some things were better experienced than explained. November 12th arrived on a Sunday that year. I woke up that morning to find the entire town unusually quiet. No cars on the streets, no one outside. The grocery store was closed despite being open every Sunday for the past 50 years. The diner was dark. Even the gas station at the edge of town had a handwritten sign taped to the door that said, "Closed for the day. Returns tomorrow." I walked downtown around noon, confused and increasingly unsettled by the emptiness. Redstone was never busy, but this was different. It felt abandoned. I knocked on a few doors, no one answered. I tried calling Mrs. Patterson, no answer. I called the police station, the phone rang 20 times before I gave up. Then, at exactly 3:47 in the afternoon, it started. I was standing on Main Street trying to decide whether to drive to the next town over to see if I could figure out what was going on when I heard the sound. It began as a low hum, almost below the range of hearing. A vibration more than a noise. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. From the ground, from the air, from inside my own chest. The hum grew louder, deeper. It resonated in my bones, made my teeth ache. The sky began to darken despite it being mid-afternoon on a clear day. Not clouds, something else. The light itself seemed to dim, like someone was slowly turning down a dimmer switch on the sun. Within minutes, Main Street was cast in a strange twilight that felt fundamentally wrong. Then the temperature dropped. It went from a mild 50 degrees to what felt like below freezing in the span of maybe 30 seconds. My breath came out in thick white clouds. Frost began to form on the windows of the buildings around me, on the pavement beneath my feet, on my own jacket. And then I saw them, figures, moving through the dim light at the far end of Main Street. At first, I thought it was townspeople finally emerging from wherever they had been hiding. But as they got closer, I realized these were not people. Not exactly. They had human shapes, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head. But they moved wrong. Their limbs bent at angles that should not have been possible. They glided rather than walked, their feet not quite touching the ground. I stood frozen, unable to move or even think clearly. The hum had become so loud it felt like my skull was vibrating. The figures moved down Main Street in a procession, maybe 20 or 30 of them. They did not acknowledge me, did not even seem to see me. They just moved past, silent except for the hum that surrounded them. They stopped in the town square, the small park area in front of the town hall where the war memorial stood. They formed a circle around the memorial, and then they began to glow, a soft, pale light that emanated from their bodies. Not bright enough to hurt my eyes, but bright enough to illuminate the square in that eerie twilight. They stood there for what might have been 5 minutes or 50. Time felt distorted, stretched. I could not look away, could not move. My body refused to obey my brain's commands to run, to hide, to do anything other than stand there and watch. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it ended. The figures faded, not disappeared, faded, like they were dissolving into the air itself. The hum ceased. The temperature returned to normal so quickly I could feel the warmth flood back into the street. The light returned. Normal daylight, normal November afternoon. I stood there gasping, my heart hammering in my chest. Within minutes, I heard the sounds of normal town life resuming. Car engines starting, doors opening, voices. People emerged from their homes and businesses as if nothing had happened. Mrs. Patterson walked past me on the sidewalk and nodded pleasantly, asking if I had a nice day. I stared at her, unable to form words. That evening, I went to her house. She invited me in for tea. I asked her what I had witnessed. She said it was the occurrence. What happens every year? What has happened every year for longer than anyone knows? She said the first written record was from 1887, but the town oral history suggested it had been happening long before European settlers arrived. The indigenous people who lived in the area before colonization had stories about it, called it the Day of Spirits. I asked her what the figures were. She said nobody knew. Theories ranged from ghosts to interdimensional beings to some kind of natural phenomenon that science had not yet explained. All anyone knew for certain was that they appeared every November 12th at exactly 3:47 p.m., performed their ritual in the town square, and then vanished. They never harmed anyone, never interacted with the living, just appeared, completed whatever they were doing, and left. For years, I accepted this. It became part of the rhythm of life in Redstone. Every November, I would stay indoors like everyone else, wait for the occurrence to pass. and then resume normal life. But in 2015, I decided I needed to document it properly, to gather evidence, to try to understand what was happening from a historical and possibly scientific perspective. I spent months preparing. I purchased video cameras, audio recording equipment, temperature monitors, electromagnetic field detectors. I researched similar phenomena reported in other locations around the world. I found scattered references to similar events, but nothing definitive. Nothing that explained what Redstone experienced every year. On November 12, 2015, I positioned myself in the town square with all my equipment. I was terrified but determined. When 3:47 arrived and the occurrence began, I documented everything. The hum, the temperature drop, the dimming light, the figures. I took video. I recorded audio. I monitored every piece of equipment I had brought. The figures appeared as they always did. But this time, when they formed their circle, one of them turned and looked directly at me. I felt its attention like a physical weight. No eyes that I could see, no features. Just a presence that focused on me with an intensity that made my blood turn to ice. It raised what might have been an arm and pointed at me. The hum intensified until I thought my eardrums would burst. Then it reached toward me. I stumbled backward, tripping over my equipment. The figure glided closer. I could feel cold radiating from it, a cold so deep it felt like it would freeze my lungs if I breathed it in. Its hand, if it was a hand, was inches from my face when the other figures seemed to react. The one reaching for me stopped, pulled back, returned to the circle. The ritual completed as it always did. They faded. Everything returned to normal. But when I gathered my equipment to review the footage and data, every single device had malfunctioned. The cameras had recorded nothing but static. The audio files were corrupted beyond recovery. The temperature monitors had flatlined. The EMF detectors had overloaded and burned out. I had spent thousands of dollars and months of preparation, and I had nothing to show for it except my own terror and the knowledge that the figures were aware of me, had seen me trying to document them, and had not liked it. Mrs. Patterson died 3 months later. Natural causes. She was 89. Before she passed, she called me to her bedside and told me that what I had done was foolish, that the town had learned centuries ago not to interfere with the occurrence, not to try to understand it, just to let it happen and be grateful that it remained benign. She said others had tried to investigate over the years. Most had their equipment fail just as mine had. A few had disappeared on November 12th and were never seen again. She begged me not to try again. I did not listen. The following year, I tried again with different equipment. Same result: malfunctioning devices, corrupted data. And this time, 2 of the figures approached me. I barely made it back to my house before they faded. I have not tried since. It has been 9 years. Every November 12th, I stay inside now like everyone else in Redstone. I close my curtains. I do not look outside between 3:47 and whenever the occurrence ends. I have learned my lesson, though it cost me my scientific curiosity and my peace of mind. The phenomenon continues, every year, exactly the same. The town accepts it because what choice do we have? We cannot stop it. We cannot explain it. We can only live with it and hope that whatever those figures are, whatever they are doing in our town square once a year, they continue to leave us alone. But I know something now that I wish I did not. When that figure pointed at me in 2015, when it reached toward me, I felt something pass between us. Knowledge, understanding, not words, something deeper. And what I understood was this: they are not visiting us. We are in their space. Redstone was built on ground that belongs to them in a way that supersedes human concepts of property and ownership. And every November 12th, they return to reclaim it, if only for a brief moment. We are tolerated, allowed to remain, but only as long as we do not interfere. My name is Jack, and for the better part of a decade, I made a living as a freelance journalist covering stories that most mainstream outlets would not touch. Cold cases, unsolved disappearances, small-town corruption. The kinds of stories that require digging through public records, conducting interviews with reluctant sources, and spending weeks in communities that did not particularly want an outsider poking around. I had published articles in several regional magazines and had built a modest following for a true crime podcast I ran independently. It was not glamorous work, but it was honest, and I believed I was giving voice to victims who had been forgotten by the system. In the spring of 2017, I received a tip about a town called Milford Springs, population 843, located in the mountains of West Virginia. The tip came from an anonymous email account. The message was brief. It stated that between 1995 and 2003, 4 people had gone missing from Milford Springs under suspicious circumstances. All 4 cases had been classified as voluntary disappearances by local law enforcement, but the families insisted their loved ones would never have left without warning. The email included names, dates, and a suggestion that I look into the sheriff at the time, a man named Warren Briggs. I spent 2 weeks researching before I ever set foot in Milford Springs. I pulled police reports, newspaper archives, and county records. The 4 missing persons were Robert Chen, age 32, disappeared June 1995. Linda Kowalski, age 28, disappeared September 1998. Marcus Delaney, age 41, disappeared March 2001. And Susan Hartley, age 35, disappeared November 2003. All 4 were described as stable, employed individuals with families and deep roots in the community. None of them had financial problems or personal issues that would suggest a reason to vanish. Yet in each case, Sheriff Briggs had closed the investigation within weeks, concluding that the individuals had left town of their own accord. I arrived in Milford Springs on a Monday in late April. The town was exactly what I expected. One main street with a handful of businesses, a diner, a hardware store, a post office, homes spread out along winding mountain roads. Everyone knew everyone. I checked into the only motel, a rundown place at the edge of town with a flickering neon sign that read vacancy. I started by interviewing the families. Robert Chen's sister still lived in town. She met with me at her kitchen table and spoke quietly as if she was afraid of being overheard. She told me her brother had been planning to get married. He had a good job as an electrician. He was happy. And then one day, he just did not come home from work. His truck was found parked at the edge of the woods outside of town, keys in the ignition, wallet and phone inside, no signs of a struggle. Sheriff Briggs had told the family that Robert must have walked into the woods voluntarily and that he would turn up eventually. He never did. Linda Kowalski's mother, now in her 70s, told me a similar story. Linda had been a teacher at the elementary school, loved by students and colleagues. No history of mental illness or substance abuse. She had gone for a walk one September evening and never returned. Her jacket was found near the river 2 days later, neatly folded and placed on a rock. Sheriff Briggs said she had likely drowned and that the body would surface downstream eventually. It never did. Marcus Delaney's wife had moved away years ago, but I tracked her down by phone. She told me Marcus had been a mechanic who worked in town. He had gone to the hardware store to pick up supplies and never came back. His truck was found in the store parking lot. The store owner said Marcus had purchased what he needed, loaded it into his truck and driven off. But Marcus never made it home, which was only 3 miles away. Sheriff Briggs suggested Marcus had run off with another woman, despite there being no evidence to support that theory. Susan Hartley's teenage son, now in his 30s, still lived in Milford Springs. He agreed to meet me at the diner. He told me his mother had been a nurse at the local clinic. She had finished her shift one November night and walked to her car in the clinic parking lot. Her car was there the next morning, locked with her purse inside. She was gone. Sheriff Briggs concluded she had met someone and left with them voluntarily. Her son said that was impossible. She would never have left him. He was 16 at the time and had been living with her. She had no reason to vanish. The pattern was clear. 4 people, 4 unexplained disappearances, 4 investigations closed prematurely by the same sheriff. I started asking questions around town about Warren Briggs. He had been sheriff from 1992 until his retirement in 2005. He had been well liked, or at least well tolerated. People described him as a man who kept order in a quiet town. No one wanted to say anything negative about him. But the way they spoke about him, the pauses and the careful word choices made it obvious they were holding something back. I requested copies of the official police reports through a Freedom of Information Act request. What I received was heavily redacted, entire sections blacked out, key witness statements missing, evidence logs incomplete. It was clear that someone did not want these cases examined too closely. I filed appeals arguing that the redactions were excessive and unjustified. The county clerk denied my appeals without explanation. I decided to try a different approach. I started looking into Warren Briggs himself, his financial records, his property holdings, his connections. That is when I found something interesting. In 1997, 2 years after the first disappearance, Briggs had purchased a 100-acre property in the mountains outside of town. The property had no structures on it according to county records, just raw land. But the purchase price was significantly higher than comparable properties in the area. I pulled the deed. The seller was listed as a private trust with an address in Delaware. I tried to trace the trust but hit a wall. It was a shell company designed to obscure the true owner. Then I found a second property. Purchased by Briggs in 2000, this one was an abandoned industrial building on the outskirts of Milford Springs, a former textile mill that had closed in the 1980s. Again, the purchase price was suspiciously high for a derelict building with no commercial value. I drove out to the property. It was surrounded by a chain-link fence with no trespassing signs posted every 20 feet. The building itself looked like it was falling apart, but the fence was new. Someone was maintaining it. I interviewed a retired dispatcher who had worked at the sheriff's office during Briggs's tenure. She agreed to meet me at a park 2 towns over. She would not talk in Milford Springs, she said. Too many people watching. She told me that Briggs had run the department like a personal fiefdom. No oversight, no accountability. He decided which cases got investigated and which got buried. She said there had been rumors over the years, whispers about people crossing Briggs and then disappearing. But no one ever spoke up. People were afraid. I asked her if she thought Briggs had killed those 4 people. She looked at me for a long time before answering. She said she did not know, but that she would not be surprised. She said Briggs had connections. People in state government, people in law enforcement, people who protected him. She told me to be careful and to watch my back. That night, someone broke into my motel room. I had gone to the diner for dinner, and when I returned, the door was ajar. My laptop was gone. My notebooks were gone. My recorder was gone. Every piece of physical evidence and every note I had taken had been stolen. The motel manager called the police. A deputy arrived, took a statement, and told me it was probably just a random theft. He suggested I file an insurance claim and move on. I knew it was not random. Someone had been watching me. Someone knew exactly what I was working on. The next morning, I went to the local sheriff's office to follow up on the theft report. The current sheriff, a man named Dale Hutchins, invited me into his office. He closed the door and asked me what I was really doing in Milford Springs. I told him I was investigating the unsolved disappearances from the 1990s and early 2000s. He leaned back in his chair and told me that those cases were closed, that there was nothing to investigate, that I should probably head back to wherever I came from before something bad happened. I asked him if that was a threat. He smiled and said it was advice. He said Milford Springs was a quiet town that liked to keep its business private. He said outsiders who stirred up trouble tended to have accidents. He said he would hate for me to become another statistic. Then he stood up, opened the door, and told me to have a safe trip home. I left Milford Springs that afternoon. I did not have a choice. My research was gone. My sources were terrified, and the local authorities had made it clear I was not welcome. I drove straight through to Virginia and checked into a motel under a fake name. I was shaken, furious, but also aware that I had stumbled onto something much bigger and more dangerous than I had anticipated. I tried to reconstruct my research from memory. I reached out to the families again, but they would not return my calls. The retired dispatcher blocked my number. Every door that had been cracked open was now slammed shut. I contacted a lawyer about pursuing the story legally, but he said without evidence, I had nothing. He suggested I drop it before I got hurt. I published a sanitized version of the story 6 months later in a regional magazine. I focused on the facts of the disappearances without implicating Briggs directly. I framed it as a human interest piece about families seeking closure. The article got minimal attention and no follow-up. I had been effectively silenced, but I kept the evidence I had gathered before the theft. Copies stored in cloud drives under encrypted accounts. Photos I had uploaded to secure servers. I kept everything because I knew that one day someone might be willing to listen. Someone might have the resources and the courage to dig deeper than I could. Warren Briggs died in 2014, natural causes, according to his obituary. He was 73 years old. He was buried in Milford Springs with full honors. The current sheriff attended the funeral. Half the town turned out to pay their respects. I read about it online and felt sick. It has been 8 years since I left Milford Springs. I still receive messages occasionally, anonymous emails with no return address. Some contain threats, others contain information, tips about other disappearances in the area, suggestions about where to look. But I have not gone back. I have not pursued the story further. I learned my lesson. Some towns protect their secrets with more than just silence. They protect them with violence and institutional power. And unless you are willing to risk everything, you walk away. I think about those 4 people sometimes, Robert, Linda, Marcus, Susan. I think about their families who never got answers. And I think about how many other small towns across this country have similar stories. Stories buried under layers of corruption and fear. Stories that will never be told because people like me are not willing to die for them. My name is Henry, and I practiced family medicine in the small town of Glenwood for just under 3 years. When I first arrived in August of 2011, fresh out of residency and eager to make a difference in rural healthcare, Glenwood seemed like the perfect place to start my career. The town had a population of roughly 900 people, most of them farming families who had lived in the area for generations. The previous doctor had retired after 40 years of service, and the community was desperate for someone to take over the practice. The pay was modest but fair, and the clinic was well equipped despite being in the middle of nowhere in rural Montana. I signed a 3-year contract and moved into a small house 2 blocks from the clinic. The first 6 months were exactly what I expected. I treated the usual array of ailments that come with rural practice: farming injuries, seasonal flu, chronic conditions like diabetes and hypertension that required ongoing management. I delivered 2 babies, stitched up countless cuts, and prescribed antibiotics for infections. The community was welcoming, grateful to have a doctor again after several months without one. Patients brought me homemade pies and jars of preserves. I was invited to Sunday dinners and town events. I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The first unusual case presented itself in March of 2012. A woman named Patricia, age 47, came in complaining of persistent fatigue and unexplained bruising on her arms and legs. Her symptoms had started about 2 weeks earlier and were getting progressively worse. I ran the standard blood work. Her white blood cell count was elevated, but not alarmingly so. Her platelet count was slightly low, which could explain the bruising. I tested for common infections, autoimmune disorders, and vitamin deficiencies. Everything came back negative or within normal ranges. I prescribed iron supplements and told her to come back in 2 weeks for follow-up. She returned 3 weeks later. The fatigue had worsened. The bruising had spread to her torso. She had developed nosebleeds that took longer than normal to stop. I ran more extensive tests, checked her liver function, kidney function, looked for signs of blood disorders or cancers. Again, nothing definitive. Her results were abnormal, but not in any pattern I recognized. I referred her to a hematologist in Billings 2 hours away. She went for the consultation. The specialist ran his own battery of tests and came to the same conclusion I had. Something was wrong, but he could not identify what. Patricia was prescribed supportive care and sent home with instructions to monitor her symptoms. Over the next few months, 3 more patients presented with similar symptoms. All of them were long-term residents of Glenwood. All of them developed fatigue, bruising, and bleeding issues that defied diagnosis. The ages ranged from 32 to 61. 2 men, 2 women. No obvious connection between them except that they all lived in Glenwood. I started keeping detailed notes on each case. I looked for commonalities, diet, occupation, lifestyle factors. I asked about their water sources, whether they used well water or municipal water. I inquired about chemical exposures, whether they worked with pesticides or industrial materials. The answers varied. Some drank well water, others used town water. Some worked in agriculture, others did not. There was no clear pattern except the symptoms themselves and the fact that all 4 patients lived within a 5-mile radius. By the fall of 2012, I had 6 patients with the mystery illness. 2 of them had deteriorated significantly. 1 had been hospitalized in Billings with internal bleeding. The other had developed severe anemia that required blood transfusions. I was terrified that I was missing something obvious, that I was failing these people who trusted me with their care. I consulted with colleagues, sent case files to specialists, reached out to infectious disease experts. No one had answers. That is when I started digging into the town's history. I spent evenings at the small public library going through old newspaper archives and county records. I was looking for anything that might explain a cluster of unexplained illnesses, industrial accidents, environmental contamination, anything that could provide a clue. What I found made my blood run cold. In 1987, 25 years before I arrived in Glenwood, a chemical manufacturing plant had operated on the outskirts of town for approximately 18 months. The plant had been shut down by federal regulators after inspectors discovered improper disposal of hazardous waste. According to the newspaper articles from that time, the company had been dumping chemical byproducts into an old quarry on the property. The contamination had been severe enough that the EPA had ordered a cleanup, which supposedly took place in 1988 and 1989. The site had been declared safe, and the land had been sold to a private buyer who turned it into farmland. I pulled up maps of the area. The old plant site was located upstream from Glenwood's primary water source, a creek that fed into the reservoir the town used for its municipal water supply. and the farmland that now occupied the former plant site was where 2 of my patients lived and worked. They grew wheat and raised cattle on land that had been contaminated with industrial chemicals less than 3 decades earlier. I requested the EPA cleanup reports through public records requests. What I received was a summary document that stated the site had been remediated to acceptable standards. But the actual testing data, the specifics of what chemicals had been present and in what quantities, were not included. I filed additional requests for the complete records. Weeks went by with no response. When I finally received a reply, I was told that the detailed reports were not available due to proprietary concerns related to the company that had operated the plant. I contacted the EPA directly, spoke to a regional representative, and explained that I had patients with mysterious illnesses and suspected environmental contamination. The representative said that if I had evidence of ongoing contamination, I should file a formal complaint and they would investigate. But I did not have evidence. I had suspicions and a correlation that might be coincidental. The representative was polite but unhelpful. By January of 2013, I had 10 patients with the mystery illness. 1 of them died. Patricia, the first patient I had seen with symptoms, succumbed to complications from internal bleeding. She was 48 years old. Her death devastated me. I felt responsible even though I knew logically that I had done everything I could with the information and resources available to me. I tried to convince the town council to commission independent water testing. I presented my case at a public meeting, explained the pattern of illnesses, and shared what I had discovered about the old chemical plant. The reaction was not what I expected. Instead of concern or support, I was met with hostility. Council members suggested I was fear-mongering. Residents accused me of trying to destroy property values and hurt local farmers. One council member, a man whose family had lived in Glenwood for 4 generations, told me that the EPA had already cleared the site and that I should focus on being a doctor instead of playing environmental activist. After the meeting, I received a visit from the mayor. He sat in my office and spoke quietly, almost gently. He said the town appreciated my dedication, but that I needed to understand something important. Glenwood was dying. The population had been declining for years. Young people left for cities, farms were failing. If word got out that there was environmental contamination, the town would collapse completely. Property would become worthless. The few businesses that remained would close. He said that sometimes, for the greater good, certain things needed to be left alone. He suggested that my patients' illnesses were likely just bad luck, genetic factors, or age-related decline. He said I should stop looking for problems that might not exist. I reported my concerns to the Montana Department of Public Health. I submitted detailed case files and requested an investigation. A representative came to Glenwood 6 weeks later. He spent 2 days in town, interviewed a few patients, collected some water samples from the municipal system, and left. I never received a formal report. When I called to follow up, I was told that the preliminary findings showed no evidence of contamination and that the case was closed. One of my patients, a farmer named Carl who had been living with the illness for over a year, pulled me aside after an appointment. He told me to stop pushing. He said that people in town were getting angry with me, that I was making enemies. He said that the previous doctor, the one who had practiced in Glenwood for 40 years, had seen similar cases. And he had kept quiet about it because he knew that speaking up would only cause trouble. Carl said I should do the same if I wanted to keep practicing in Glenwood. I could not do that. I could not watch people get sick and die while pretending everything was fine. So I contacted a journalist at a regional newspaper, someone who had a reputation for investigating environmental issues. I shared everything I had learned, the history of the chemical plant, the cluster of illnesses, the stonewalling by local and state authorities. The journalist was interested. He said he would look into it. 3 days later, my contract with the Glenwood Clinic was terminated. The stated reason was budget constraints, but I knew the real reason. Someone with influence had decided I was a problem that needed to be removed. I was given 30 days to vacate the clinic and my housing. The journalist never published the story. When I followed up with him, he said his editor had killed the piece. He would not elaborate, but he suggested off the record that there had been pressure from somewhere higher up. He apologized and said he had to move on to other stories. I left Glenwood in May of 2013. I took a position at a hospital in Seattle, far away from small towns and their secrets. But I still think about my patients, the ones who died and the ones who are still living with symptoms that no one can or will explain. I think about the children growing up in Glenwood, drinking water that might be contaminated, playing on land that might still harbor toxins buried in the soil. I reported everything to the CDC before I left, submitted a detailed epidemiological report, requested a formal investigation. I received an automated response acknowledging receipt of my submission. I never heard anything else. Sometimes I search online for news from Glenwood, looking for reports of more illnesses, looking for evidence that someone finally took action. I never find anything. The town continues to exist in quiet obscurity, and whatever is making people sick continues to spread through the community unchecked, protected by fear and willful ignorance and the desperate need to preserve a dying way of life. My name is Daniel, and for 15 years I worked as a sales representative for an industrial supply company covering a territory that spanned 3 states. The job meant a lot of driving, long hours on rural highways, and spending nights in cheap motels in towns I would never visit otherwise. I did not mind. I liked the solitude of the road, the freedom of setting my own schedule, and the simplicity of a job that required nothing more than showing up, making my pitch, and moving on to the next account. I had done this work for so long that I could drive for hours on autopilot, my mind wandering while my hands steered the car along familiar routes. In October of 2016, I was driving through eastern Oregon, heading from one small town to another along a 2-lane highway that cut through miles of empty landscape. It was late, probably around 10:30 at night, and I had been on the road since early morning. My plan had been to reach the next town, check into a motel, and get a decent night of sleep before my morning appointments. But somewhere between nowhere and nowhere else, my car started making a noise I did not like. A grinding sound from the engine that got progressively louder until I could not ignore it anymore. I pulled over to the shoulder, turned off the engine, and popped the hood. I am not a mechanic, but I know enough to check the basics. The engine was overheating. Steam was rising from somewhere near the radiator. I could see a leak, coolant dripping onto the ground beneath the car. I was stranded on a dark highway with no cell signal and no idea how far I was from the nearest town. I grabbed my phone and checked. No service. I tried walking up and down the highway, holding my phone up like that would somehow magically find a signal. Nothing. I could see lights in the distance, maybe 2 or 3 miles off the road. A town, or at least something resembling one. I locked my car, grabbed my flashlight and wallet, and started walking. The road that led off the highway toward the lights was narrow and unpaved, more of a dirt path than an actual road. No signs indicating where it led or what was out there, but I did not have many options. Walking back the way I had come would mean at least 20 miles before I reached anything, and I was already exhausted. So I followed the lights. It took me about 40 minutes to reach the town, and calling it a town was generous. It was more like a cluster of buildings arranged around a single street, maybe 20 structures total. A few houses, what looked like a general store, a garage with a single gas pump out front. Everything was dark except for streetlights that cast a yellow glow over empty sidewalks. No cars, no people, no sound except the wind and my own footsteps. I walked down the main street looking for any sign of life. Every building was closed, curtains drawn, doors locked. I knocked on a few doors, no answer. I tried the garage thinking maybe there was a mechanic who lived on the premises. The door was locked and the windows were dark. I stood in the middle of that empty street and felt a growing sense of unease. It was too quiet, too empty. Towns this small might roll up the sidewalks early, but there should have been something. A dog barking, a television flickering through a window. Something. That is when I noticed the church. It was at the far end of the street, a small white building with a steeple, and unlike everything else in town, it was lit up. Light poured from the windows, bright and warm. I could hear voices, not words, just the murmur of many people talking. I felt a surge of relief. People. Help. I walked quickly toward the church. As I got closer, the voices became clearer, but they were not speaking English, or any language I recognized. It was something guttural and rhythmic, rising and falling in a pattern that sounded almost like chanting. I reached the church and looked through one of the windows. What I saw made no sense. The interior of the church was packed with people. At least 50 of them, maybe more. They were standing in rows facing the front where an altar should have been. But there was no altar. Instead, there was something I cannot adequately describe. An object, hovering in the air about 6 feet off the ground. It was roughly spherical but seemed to shift and change shape as I looked at it. The surface was reflective, but not like metal or glass, more like liquid mercury rippling and flowing. And it glowed, not bright enough to hurt my eyes, but enough to illuminate the entire room in pale blue light. The people in the church were all facing this object. They were not moving, not swaying or gesturing, just standing perfectly still with their heads tilted back, staring at it. And they were chanting in that strange, guttural language. The sound was hypnotic, unsettling. I stood at that window for what might have been 30 seconds or 5 minutes. Time felt distorted, and then one of them turned and looked directly at me. Their eyes were wrong, reflecting the blue light in a way that made them seem to glow from within. And when they saw me, they stopped chanting. Then another turned. Then another. Within seconds, every person in that church was staring at me through the window. I ran. I did not think, did not process, just turned and ran back the way I had come. I could hear the church door opening behind me. Footsteps, many footsteps. I did not look back. I ran down that empty street, past the closed buildings, past the dark houses, back toward the dirt road that led to the highway. The footsteps followed. I could hear them getting closer. They were not running, just walking, but walking fast, too fast. I was sprinting, my lungs burning, my legs screaming, and they were keeping pace just by walking. I reached the dirt road and kept running. My flashlight beam bounced wildly ahead of me, illuminating rocks and ruts in the path. I stumbled, caught myself, kept going. The footsteps behind me never wavered, never slowed. I do not know how long I ran. It felt like hours, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. And then I heard a sound that almost made me cry with relief. An engine, headlights appeared on the highway ahead. A truck. I ran toward it, waving my arms, shouting for help. The truck stopped. The driver rolled down his window. He was an older man, probably in his 60s, with a weathered face and suspicious eyes. He asked what I was doing out here. I tried to explain. My car broke down. I walked to that town. Something was wrong there. People were chasing me. The words came out jumbled and frantic. He told me to get in. I climbed into the passenger seat and locked the door. I looked back down the dirt road. The footsteps had stopped. Nobody was there. The road was empty, but I knew they had been following me. I knew what I had seen. The driver asked where my car was. I told him. He drove me back to it, maybe 2 miles up the highway. He looked at the engine, saw the coolant leak, and said he could tow me into the next town, which was another 15 miles east. He had a tow truck, ran a garage there. I agreed. I would have agreed to anything to get away from that place. We loaded my car onto the tow truck and started driving. I asked him about the town I had walked to, the place with the church. He looked at me strangely and said there was no town in that direction, nothing for 30 miles except empty land. I insisted. I had been there. I had seen it. Buildings, streetlights, a church full of people. He pulled over, turned on the overhead light in the cab, pulled out a map, showed me where we were, the highway, the surrounding area. According to the map, the dirt road I had walked down led to nothing. An old mining claim that had been abandoned since the 1950s. No structures, no town, nothing. I told him he was wrong. The map was wrong. I had been there. He looked at me the way you look at someone who might be losing their mind. He asked if I had been drinking. I had not. He asked if I was on any medications. I was not. He suggested that sometimes exhaustion and stress could make people see things that were not there. I did not argue. What was the point? We reached the next town around 1 in the morning. He dropped my car at his garage and said he would look at it in the morning. I checked into a motel and did not sleep. I kept replaying what I had seen. The church, the object, the people with their glowing eyes, the footsteps following me in the dark. The next morning I went back. I borrowed a car from the mechanic and drove back to the highway, back to the spot where I had pulled over. I found the dirt road. I followed it. It led to exactly what the mechanic had said. An abandoned mining site, a few collapsed structures, rusted equipment, and empty land. No town, no church, no streetlights, nothing. I took pictures, walked the entire area, looked for any evidence that what I had seen the night before had been real. I found nothing. The mechanic fixed my car that afternoon, a new hose and fresh coolant. I paid him and left. I have never driven through that part of Oregon again. I tried researching the area later, looking for historical records of towns that might have existed and been abandoned, reports of unusual phenomena, anything that might explain what I experienced. I found nothing definitive, a few vague references to strange lights seen in the area over the years, a couple of forum posts from people claiming to have seen structures that disappeared, but nothing concrete, nothing I could point to and say, see, I was not crazy. It has been 9 years. I still do not know what I saw that night. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe stress caused some kind of hallucination. But hallucinations do not chase you. Hallucinations do not leave you running for your life on a dark road in the middle of nowhere. Whatever was in that church, whatever that object was, it felt real. It felt dangerous. And the people staring at me with those glowing eyes were not figments of my imagination. I changed my route after that. I drive hours out of my way to avoid that stretch of highway. And every time I pass through a small town late at night, I make sure not to stop. Because I learned something that October night in 2016. Some places exist in ways we do not understand, and some things are better left alone.